Good morning or afternoon, everyone, depending on where you're located. Welcome to another Webinar Wednesday. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Stephen Phelps, and I'm the marketing manager here at Acumen. And today's topic is safeguarding your business from fraud with a remote workforce. In today's session, we brought in Robert and Nancy Lavery from Lavery and Associates, who are experts in this field and have been working with Sage 300 for over 20 years. Please note that this webinar is in listen-only mode and should last around 45 to 60 minutes. If you have any questions, then please use the chat option and we'll answer them near the end of the presentation. So let's go ahead and get started. So the goal of today's webinar is to show you how to create a remote workforce environment that is focused on preventing errors or worst case fraud by creating strong internal controls. In this session, Robert and Nancy will show you how to be more prepared and provide you with new ways to improve your paper processes by giving you the control and visibility you need within Sage 300. The agenda today, we're going to look at a high-level check approvals and how they work, how to force approvals around AP payments, backup documentation, and how you can store documents outside of Sage 300 and view them within. Separation of duties and how does that work, using or transitioning to ACH or EFT, how to look for duplicated checks and using functionality like positive pay to help protect you against check fraud. And then finally, we'll take a look at your check audits and security controls that you could be using. But before we begin, we're going to do two quick polling questions. So the first question is, what is the percentage of small and medium-sized businesses falling victim to fraud? Is it 18%, 32%, 52%, or actually 51%, or 66%? So I'll go ahead and just give me 1 second and I'll have you guys vote. So right now we're around 50% thinking that it's 32%. We have 17 thinking that's 51, and then we have 33% thinking that it's 66. So I'll end the poll. So the correct answer is actually 66%, according to the National Federation of Independent Business. A lot of that is due to smaller companies not having strong internal controls or processes in place to detect fraud or theft. So let's move on to one more question. So with our second question, it says, with a remote workforce, how are you dealing with paper processes today? Is it lots of boxes in home offices, scanning and storing on Dropbox or Google Drive, accessing and storing scanned copies on corporate network, or scanning and storing with transactions within Sage 300. So let me launch this poll and we'll take a few seconds. So I'm seeing a few scanning and storing on Dropboxes. We have a little bit of file boxes in home offices. And it looks like we have a good amount, around 90% accessing and storing scanned copies on a corporate network. I don't see anyone scanning and storing with transactions with Sage 300. So looks like there'll be an opportunity for that. And I'll go ahead and end the poll. So with that, we'll go ahead and I'll pass this on to Nancy and Robert to begin.
So you should all see my Sage 300 desktop AP transaction folder.
Yes, looks great.
Perfect. Thanks very much, Stephen. Good afternoon or good morning, everyone. Thanks very much for taking some time with us today. So I thought I would start with the document management solution. I'm quite happy to see the results of the poll that most of you are accessing and storing your documents on a corporate network. That will work beautifully with Sage 300 and the document management link solution that I'm going to show you. I'm actually doing the same thing. I'm storing my documents in network folders. And with the document management link product, it's providing a link from the folders that you're storing your documents in on your network to the screen of Sage 300 and displaying those documents. So when I open up a standard Sage 300 screen, we're not changing anything about the underlying screen or functionality. You'll just see this additional window appear beside the Sage screen. You can change the size of this window just by dragging the corners, and you'll notice that a scroll bar will appear in the windows if you exceed the size of the window. So what we're doing with this product is we're linking not only to the screen of Sage 300, but directly to a field on that screen. So in the first case, I'm linking to the vendor number field. And so we're linking to the field vendor number, and then dependent on the value within that field, it knows which documents to display. So I mentioned my documents are being stored in network folders, and I just want to verify that you're now seeing my file explorer. I want to make sure I have the right window open. So now you're seeing the folders?
Yes, so now we can see the folders.
Perfect. So on my C drive, I created a folder that I called Orchid, and then a document folder. And then I have separate folders here for the different types of documents that I'm storing. This folder hierarchy would be completely up to you and dependent on what documents you want to be seeing and how you want to be storing them. But for my AP documents, I'm storing by my vendor. So I've got these folders here related to my vendors. So a folder for my vendor 1200 and a folder for my vendor 1400. Now, once you get this folder hierarchy in place, then it can start to build out for you automatically. So in this example, if I go to link a document for a vendor that does not currently have a folder, then the software can create that folder and file the document appropriately. But if I open up the vendor 1200 folder, you'll see the 4 documents in that folder are the 4 documents we're seeing in the document management link window. Okay,
Yes,
so and now I think when I open network folders, we should be okay. I apologize. So so that's what we're seeing in this first box here is the documents for the vendor number. Now, what I've done in the second window is you have the ability to filter what you're seeing. So I'm still linking to that vendor number folder, but I'm filtering the contents of that folder, and I'll be able to view only the documents that relate to this particular entry. So although I'm filing it once, I'm able to filter the contents of that folder. So typically speaking, you're going to be adding documents as you're entering transactions in Sage 300. And so when I hover over the document management link window, you can see this add button appears. So by clicking on that, it gives me the ability to go out into my environment and pick up a document that I want to link through the document management link window. I'm using a suspense folder as an example. So, that's one way that you can manage your documents, just scan them all into one folder. And then when you're entering transactions, you can just go to one location to find the documents that you're looking for. And then when you drag them and drop them into the document management link window, it will refile those documents for you. So it just makes it easier for users entering to just go to one place to find everything, and then it'll get refiled as you link it through the document management link window. So in this case, I'm just going to grab this invoice. So I'm clicking on the invoice and drag it and drop it over the document management link window. So what's happened in this case is it's taken a copy of that invoice and it's filed it into my vendor 1200 folder. You may notice that it also changed the name. And so that's an optional configuration where I've specified to rename the document based on the value in the document number field. So that's why it renamed it May 12-1. Typically speaking, that's going to be your invoice number. Now, in my case, for demo purposes, I've left that invoice in my suspense folder. In a real life scenario, you would just hold the shift key on your keyboard when you do that drag and drop, and it will move the document. So you're not storing multiple copies of the same document. Now, what I've done in the third window is I've linked it against the purchase order number. Now, I would have added those documents when I was entering the purchase order in the PO module, but because that field is displayed on the AP invoice entry screen, I'm able to see those documents. So again, storing those documents once, but I'm able to view those documents around multiple screens in Sage 300. So you have the option to only view documents against one particular screen, or as I've done with the purchase order number, I'm choosing to see those documents in all screens of Sage 300 where that purchase order number is displayed. The bottom box is where, oh, I should mention this green box here. So there's another product that's a notes product, and it works similarly to Document Management Link in that you can store notes against any field in Sage 300, and these would be free form notes. In this case, I've got shipping notes to make deliveries to the back door. Obviously, that's a bright green. I can color code the notes. So, my admin notes might be pink. My shipping notes in this case are green, to make them easily identifiable to users, whether it's something that they need to pay attention to or not. You notice I can edit this note. Some users may be able to add new notes or delete existing notes, or in this case, edit a note. So that is a separate product, but just explaining what that green box is there. But back to Document Management Link, I've also done a configuration around the GL account. And that's just showing that I can link documents to these entry grid fields as well. So you can link your documents to any field on any screen in any module of Sage 300, and that would include any third-party modules. So today you're going to see it working around the payment approval software. And Rob's going to be showing you the EFT product, and this would work around the EFT product as well. So typically speaking, any module that you see that installs within your menu of modules in Sage 300, you can use Document Management Link for those modules as well. We've also provided a tool. So this product runs on what we call a tray icon, and we provide you with a tool that is going to show you what the correct roto ID is. So every screen in Sage 300 has a number associated with it. And this tool will be able to show you what that roto ID is and what the correct field name for you to configure the product around. And you notice this one's batch date. So anything that's system generated, like the batch number, for example, or the purchase order number, you can link to those fields as well. You would just save an entry to generate the number, and then you can link documents to that purchase order number or batch number, whatever the case may be. So this all installs in a module that we call Information Manager. And I'm not going to go too far into configuration, but just to give you an idea, I would say the majority of your time to set up this product would be determining where you want to be seeing those documents and how you want to be filing them. But just to give you a bit of an idea, we're using network folders today, but if any of you are using SharePoint, you could store your documents in SharePoint and link them, or something like Google Docs or Dropbox. This product will work with all of those. It's the same conceptually in that we're just providing a link from where you're storing those documents to the screen of Sage 300. As far as SharePoint goes, there would be a little bit of additional configuration because we're linking to the SharePoint site. But effectively, it's going to be the same configuration where you're going to identify the fields that you want to link documents to. So in my example, we were linking to the vendor number field. And then I wanted to filter the contents of that. And I wanted to do that based on the document number. And then you're going to put in the file path to where you're storing those documents. So in my case, my C drive, my Orchid folder, the document folder, I had a folder for AP documents. And then this curly bracket value is referencing the vendor number. So that's how the software knows when I store a document for a vendor that doesn't have a folder, use the value, i.e. the vendor number, to create that file and then store the document in that file. And in the case of renaming the document, I specified I want to use value 2 being the document number, and that's how it knows how to rename the document based on the document number. So you would go about doing your configuration, but as I mentioned, I think the longest time really is just determining where you want to be viewing those documents within Sage 300. So I'm going to move along now to the check approval product, and you'll see the document management link working around that product as well. So you notice I named this batch Acumen webinar May 12. So this is the batch that we're going to be using to do our payment approvals. And I want to start at the AP invoice entry to show you that we're really not changing anything about the way you're entering your payments currently. With the check approval product, it's literally putting a control around the printing of your checks and posting of the payment batch. So everything else that you're currently doing would all remain the same. So what I've got here is I've got the first document is for $806. The second document is for $2,500. And the third document is for $3,200. And I'm mentioning that because what I've done within the check approval product is I've set a dollar value threshold. So my first level of approval is my general manager, and I'm saying that manager has a $2,000 approval limit. So if anything exceeds $2,000, I want you to go to the controller for that approval. And that's because I've set this that checks above the limit that I've set needs to be approved at a higher level. So what this means is anything below $2,000 will go to the general manager. Anything above $2,000 will skip the general manager and go to the controller for approval. So that's one of the options. You also have the option to have approvals done at each level. So I can set up to 3 levels of approval here. And I can specify it's going to go to level 1. When they're done with it, it'll go to level 2 and then on to level 3. So you can have those 1 to 3 levels of approval, or as we're going to see today, you can set a dollar value threshold. Now we're linking to a SQL database, and that is the approval console. So the approvals are done outside of Sage 300. But literally you set up a SQL instance and you come to the database tab and hit create for that. So it's quite simple to set this product up. It's just this one screen. So when we go up to the accounts payable module, you'll see this extended payment. So this is the payment entry screen for the check approval product. But when I open it up, you'll see that it's the same screen that you're familiar with now. So we're just going to create a new payment batch. And we'll say entry 1. And we're going to choose our vendor number 1200 in the first case. And here we are down here. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't post the invoice batch. Sorry about that. Let's do that. So let's post that. So if you recall, I had one invoice that's below $2,000, and then I had 2 that are above $2,000. So we'll expect the first invoice to go to the general manager and the next 2 to go to our controller for approval. So for my vendor 1200, There's our May 12th invoice. So we'll say yes and add that to our payment batch. And there was also our entry 3 was for vendor 1200. So there's our entry 3. So we'll add that to our batch. And then the other payment was for our vendor 1400. And that's our entry number 2 here. So I've added those 3 payments to my payment batch. So, nothing changes there in terms of what you're currently doing. But if I were to try and print the checks and post the batch, I'm going to have a message pop up to say that this batch has not yet been approved. So you can't print those checks and post the batch. So this additional button will appear to submit for approval. That button will dynamically change as it goes through the approval process, and ultimately it'll sit as approved. But let's just go ahead and submit that for approval. So what would happen at this point is an email notification would go out to let our approvers know that there's something that requires their approval. And this button will change to an in progress status, and this batch will be put on hold. So anyone else coming in will be able to easily see that the approval is in progress. And you can click on this button, and if it's partway through the approval process, you'll be able to see who's done the approvals as well. So when we go to our approval console, so I'm going out to my start menu to run the approval console. If you wanted to run this on something like an iPad, you could do that with the correct infrastructure. You'd be able to do that. So I'm not using a Sage LAN pack when I'm doing these approvals. You do have to set up the users in Sage 300 to grant them access to the product, but they do not have to log into Sage 300 in order to do an approval. So when I sign in as my general manager, we'll expect to see one payment there for approval by the general manager. Now, for anyone that's running multiple Sage 300 companies, you'll notice I have Sage Sample Company and my TAIROX company. So you can filter multiple companies into the same approval console if you want to. So if you have the same person responsible for doing approvals across companies, then you could have them all go into one approval console, and you'll just have a tree view menu of the batches for each company. Alternately, you could have them go into separate approval consoles if need be. So here's the batch that we created today, and we're seeing, as expected, just the one document that was under $2,000 for approval. I can see the batch number, the bank that it's drawn against, and it has an integration with Document Management Link. So although I'm not inside Sage 300 with this product because a special integration was written, I can view the documents through this approval console. So I can see the backup related to the payment that I'm doing an approval for. So I'm going to go ahead and approve this. And then we'll log in as our controller. And we'll expect to see the other 2 payments within our batch. So there's the other 2 payments that were over $2,000. Now, the reason I did 2 payments is you have an option to decline payments in a batch. And that's what we're going to do. We're going to decline this $2,500 payment. And the thought being, there may be a payment within a batch that you don't necessarily want to submit payment for at this particular point in time. And we don't want to hold up the rest of the batch. So you can decline payments within a batch. And what will happen in that case, in our case today, I've configured it to say, I want to create a new batch for any payments that were declined. Or you can turn that feature off and you can just say, I'm going to decline these payments And at some point down the road, a user is just going to re-enter the payment for that invoice. Now, when I do decline something, it's going to ask me to put in a comment. So I'm just going to say pay later. And that's a way for you to track why that particular payment was declined within that payment batch. Save my entries and I can approve this. This return button, you know, in a multi-layer approval process, I could return it to the person ahead of me that did an approval, or I can return it all the way back to the person that originated the request for approval if I want some kind of changes made within Sage 300. But we'll go ahead and approve this. So for our batch 80 has been approved. And when we go back into the payment batch, you'll see right here is our Acumen batch. It's approved. So there's no lag time. There's no additional feature that you have to run to update the batch. It's going to automatically update for you. And the check that we declined, and it will tell me check not approved in batch 80 for $2,500. It's created batch number 81 for that. But at this point is when I can print the check and post that payment batch. And it'll go ahead and post that batch. And this is at the point where the EFT is going to pick up this batch. But before I pass it over to Rob, I just want to quickly mention another product that forces a segregation of duties. So you may have a case where you have, let's stick with accounts payable. You have an accounts payable department. You have multiple people in that department that all basically do the same job. And so you want to force a separation of duties. So what the SOX Second Sight product does is you're able to grant people the access in Sage 300 to participate in batches and post batches. But this product puts the control in place to say, if a user participated in a batch, they can't be the person that posts that batch. So you can grant them the access in Sage 300, but this product is going to be doing the checking in the background. And you can specify which batches you want to force that separation of duties, at least 2 sets of eyes on every batch. With accounts payable, your invoice, your payment, and your adjustment batches, you can use this product for accounts receivable, and you can use it against your general ledger batches. So just to force a separation of duties so that at least 2 people see every batch before it gets posted. So with that, I will pass it over to Rob to show you the EFT product.
All right, so you should be looking at the EFT transactions in Sage 300. So EFT processing is a third-party module developed by a company called Orchid Systems, and they are specialists in EFT processing around the globe. They sell this product internationally as well as here in North America. And they've developed a number of different file types for banks and financial institutions all around the world. And essentially, when we talk about introducing EFT or ACH processing within Sage 300, what we're really saying is that rather than producing a paper-based check, as Nancy showed in printing to the screen when she created and approved those payments, instead what we do is we can post the batch and create an EFT file against the posted batch. And that's actually one of the controls that you can set up under the setup options with EFT. When we create and configure the EFT module, we can ask whether we allow unposted batches to be selected. And as a best practice, we would suggest no to that question, because as you're probably aware, when you make changes to an unposted batch in Sage 300, there's no record of those changes unless you're using an audit logging tool that's recording every change in the database. And the benefit of combining EFT with the TAIROX SOX check approval is that you can force a batch to be approved before it can be posted. And then you know if you configure EFT to only use posted payment batches when it creates the EFT or ACH file, you know by definition that those payments have all been approved and reviewed. So that's how we combine the security and approvals of the TAIROX SOX check approval with the EFT processing module. Now, there's a number of other ways that you can secure the information and provide security routines within Sage 300 that are simply taking advantage of some of the existing functionality you already have. And we'll be talking about that when we look at the configuration of the EFT vendors. But to start with, when we look at the banks themselves, to create an EFT file requires that you have a file type associated with the bank that you're going to be generating these EFT files for. And as I mentioned, we have files for banks and financial institutions all around the world. So it doesn't matter whether your vendors are located in the US, in Canada, or other countries around the world. We have formats that will support transactions for payments anywhere in the world. The other thing to note is that it's not just check payments that we're talking about. We have the ability to do standard ACH payments, but we also have positive pay formats for those situations where you're still generating a paper-based check, but you want to be able to verify which checks have been produced by sending a file to your particular bank to verify what checks have been set up and sent to vendors. Now, it's interesting that we're on USA Wells Fargo here. We've just been notified a couple of weeks ago with one of the business partners that we work with in the US that they had sent a payment on a check for over $15,000 that somehow got intercepted and was fabricated in order to commit a check fraud against their business. So they are currently, as of a couple of days ago, we were just speaking with them. She said it's an absolute nightmare because they're having to deal with the fraud squad at the local police, Wells Fargo internal audit, and all this kind of paperwork that has to be completed to verify what was done, and they're following up. And it might take, they said, between 90 and 120 days, and this is what Wells Fargo told her, and that there's no guarantee that they can recover the funds. And so even today, with all of the electronic options that we have for making payments, why anyone continues to make paper-based check payments is beyond me, because I get that it's easy and a lot of people like the idea of signing on a check. But the reality is that it's easy to commit a check fraud even in today's age. And it's a costly endeavor for the business. As Stephen alluded to, 66% of small and medium-sized businesses are dealing with check frauds. And I don't know if you saw the NBC Dateline show a few years ago. They talked about how easy it is, particularly with color photocopiers, to take a copy of a legitimate check and make it an illegitimate check. And so we actually did an experiment several years ago where we copied a check and we taped on the microcode, because as you're familiar with the pre-printed check stock, there's a microcode at the bottom of the check that is information about your bank, transit number, and financial institution number. And we put that into the banking system as a test. And in fact, at the end of the month, we had two checks that were identical that cleared on the same bank statement. One was the real legitimate check, one was the photocopy. And when we went to the bank to explain what had happened, before they called the police on us, we said, no, this is just simply a test, and we're just showing you that there's a flaw in the system here, and they agreed. And in fact, we found out based on some additional research that there's $1 billion worth of check fraud committed in America every year. And that's a big number when you think about $1 billion. But in fact, it's less than 1% of the payment transactions that are processed in a 12-month calendar year. So it's a small percentage. The banks are aware of it, but they don't make a big deal of it. They don't want it to be public knowledge necessarily, because they don't want people to fear the banking system or the security and controls that are part of it. It's still a small percentage, but if it affects you as an individual business, it can be an administrative nightmare and obviously upsetting, particularly in this case, if this business loses $15,000. So it does support positive pay. It also supports other types of payments like international wires, standard check formats. We can support things like PayPal, credit card even though we're not a merchant account, we can process the payment once it's been approved. And so it doesn't really matter what kind of payment you want to make, as long as your bank has a specification for the file type and the payment type that you want to process electronically, then we can incorporate that into the EFT processing system. So that's an important thing for you to note. If you're interested in deploying this within your business, then you need to go to your bank and ask for that specification, because that tells us the layout of the file that's required in order for you to process payments to your vendors electronically. And the other thing to note about these files is that they are very secure. There are hash totals and check digits within these files to help the bank verify that they're legitimate transactions. In fact, even a space is considered a character, and if even one character is out of alignment in the file, they generally reject those files. So while it's never impossible, it's very unlikely that using EFT you can have a check fraud committed, because you also then have passwords that control access to the bank website when you're uploading these files for processing through the bank. But as I say, that's an important aspect in configuring the software to make sure that you're able to generate EFT files. So once you've got the bank specification, you're attaching that with your existing bank that you've already set up within Sage 300. So what you'll do is you'll identify a path where you want that file to be loaded or stored prior to you uploading that to the bank website. And then you can choose the file type that, as we've just talked about, we could choose any of the banks or financial institutions that you're using. So if we look at a US-based bank, let's take US Bank of America. And then you will also be able to output that as a file on your network. And typically we would suggest you put that on a secure drive or even a separate domain that's controlled access rights through the active Windows directory. And that will protect the file. But then of course you could separate the person who generates the EFT file from the person who takes that file and uploads it to the bank website. So typically it's a two-step process where you generate the EFT file and then you upload that file to the bank. But we've also added the ability for you to use a secure file transfer protocol. So if your bank supports an FTP site that is secure, then you can upload the file automatically to an SFTP site that the bank provides to you. And in that case, then it's just one step for you where you generate the file, it gets uploaded to their secure file transfer protocol site, and then they take responsibility for pulling those files into the bank system to generate the payments that are required. So if you do that, then there's a key file that you have to get from your bank, and that's like a token that identifies who you are and validates that you're a customer of the bank and that this is a file that they've already set up with you through your banking relationship. So those are a couple of other ways that we can provide some security routines around both the generation and the processing of these EFT files. But in addition to that, we also want to be careful about what vendors we're paying. So when we set up our EFT vendors, we can take any of the vendors that have been set up previously within the accounts payable module, and we can add their bank information into the system. So when we set up EFT banks, it's your bank account with a file type that identifies the format based on the service and the type of payment that you're making with your bank. But then you also need to get the information from your vendors for their bank account details, and you set that up in the system. So it will include their bank branch and account number and things like that. But in order for you to be able to send payments electronically to these vendors, they have to have an active status. So this is another control measure that we build into the system for you. And that is, we have an entered status, and then we have an active or inactive status. If it's entered or inactive, you cannot send payments to them. So as a control measure, what we recommend, again, as a best practice, is that you default the vendor status when you're setting them up for ACH payment purposes to default to entered. And then one person sets up the vendor, another person comes in and makes that vendor active by changing the status. And you can control that through the standard administrative services security groups within Sage 300. Again, because EFT is written in what we call the SDK, or the software development kit for Sage 300, it looks and it behaves just like any other module within Sage 300. So what we do here is we set up one user to be able to set up the EFT details for your vendors. And we provide security access for another individual to do the approval on the vendor bank account details. So this person will set up the vendor. This person will change the status from entered to active. And this is just part of the standard security group option that you have to control access rights to the modules within Sage 300. So by doing that, you create the ability to monitor which vendors are getting set up and when they get set up for approval. In addition to that, we provide a log. So while we can control who is changing the vendor statuses, we have a log for every time you create an EFT file with a unique EFT file creation number. So there's always a test for completeness. We put a date and a timestamp on that. And we tell you the user within Sage 300 who created that EFT batch, the bank against which it's been created, and the folder that that file has been stored in, along with the dollar value of the transactions. So when we generate this log, we also give you the ability to go in and drill into that batch to see the payments that have been set up and the vendor details. So this is all included online, so that you don't have to produce paper-based reports. Particularly these days when a lot of people are working remotely, we want to be able to support access to information in a secure and controlled manner without having to generate paper-based reports and email them or PDF them as attachments to email. Because as soon as you start introducing information that goes outside of Sage 300, you open up the possibility for misuse or misdistribution of that data. So that's a log that confirms the EFT files that have been created and where that information is stored. But we also have a log for the vendors themselves. So going back to that status of going from entered to active, we can actually create an audit log around each new vendor that's been set up in the system. And again, we'll have a date and a timestamp for each vendor that you create, the user who created them, and the information that's been set up as a new value for any new vendors. But then as that information changes, you can see the old value and what was changed to in the new value column. And again, when that status gets changed from entered to active, that's something that can be logged in the system as well. And so that's also an inquiry that you can go in and view the information, but all of these logs can also be set up and generated as reports if you'd like to. So you can have some hard copy in a report form, or you can access that information through the inquiry. So it's another way that we create segregation of duties and some security controls built into the system to maintain the integrity and the security, but also the privacy of that sensitive information around your vendor's bank details and who's able to process payments within the system. So the other thing that we do is when we're talking about the options and wanting to secure the data, we can also encrypt the information for the vendor's bank account details. And so whenever we generate a remittance advice as an example, and I'll do that right now, you'll see that the information can be encrypted when we generate these remittance advices acknowledging payment to our vendors. Now, these remittance advices are crystal forms, so there's no magic here that's using the standard report writing capability of Sage 300. But as you can see, the account number and the financial institution number is zeroed out, starred out, or X'd out. But then because it's a crystal form, you can format the data. You could hide that data completely if you're not comfortable including it on the remittance advice. You can also put the invoice details, amounts, and dates that you're paying. And this is something that you could print out and mail to your vendors. But because we're using an electronic payment to pay our vendors, what we want to do is avoid paper as much as possible. So instead of printing, what we recommend is you email by using a delivery method based on what you've set up with the vendor customer. And you notice that when we change the delivery method, we also get a message ID coming up on the screen. And what that's referring to is the ability to generate an email message with your payments. So rather than having to fold stuff and mail the remittance advice, you can send that electronically as an email, and the remittance advice will be a PDF or an RPT attachment on that email. So in this template, you can create the wording that you want to include on the email, and we give you a number of different variables to include payment dates, a list of the documents, who the vendor contact is. And so to be able to take advantage of that, when you're setting up the EFT vendors, you can choose which email address to use. You can either use an email address that you set up here under the EFT vendor, or you can use the email address that's already set up for your AP vendors. And under the AP vendors, you may have noticed this, that on the processing page, you have contacts email and email. If you choose contacts email, it will use this email address on the contact page. If you use email, it picks up the email address on the address page. So in either case, you can use one of those three different fields to store the email addresses for the people that you want to send those remittance advices to. Now, if the email addresses are short enough, you can incorporate multiple emails, like at least 2 different contacts in the email too, and just use a semicolon to separate them. And that will allow you to send these remittance advices to multiple people. But when we do that, and we're setting up the email, you can go directly to the email server and use a secure connection to the email server to send out these emails in a batch format. Now, there are some challenges sometimes with firewalls. So it's a good idea to send a test email to make sure that there's a relay connection from the workstation that's generating the remittance advices and the email server that you want to send them to. You need to have an open port, and you can identify the port number in the email server address when you're configuring the email setup. You just want to make sure that the IT department is comfortable with the outbound relaying that's being required here to send the outbound emails. And because of spam, you can limit the number of emails that are going out every minute to make sure that your antivirus software doesn't stop, or firewalls don't stop the communication going out, because there's a large number of emails being sent out automatically. But those are, again, some of the ways that we secure the data. The last thing here is when we're attaching that remittance advice to the email, you can password protect that by creating a password formula so that only the person that knows the password is able to actually open that remittance advice. So between the segregation of duties on the vendor setup, the encryption on the bank account details, the remittance advice passwords, as much as possible, we're trying to build in some security to maintain the integrity and privacy of that information, because it is sensitive information when we're talking about bank account details. Now, the other thing when we talk about the options to create a nice clean audit trail is that we can either skip over non-EFT vendors in a payment batch, or we can display an error if we find a non-EFT vendor. And this assumes that we're segregating our EFT vendors from our non-EFT vendors when we're creating our payment batches. Some of our clients go to the extent within bank services of setting up a unique series of document numbers for their EFT versus their non-EFT check payments. So you see, we can have laser, which is our standard pre-printed stock, or we can have EFT. And you can create a different check form with a different series of numbers used for the EFT payments. And this just creates a nice clean audit trail for you so that you've got a separate series of documents for EFT versus non-EFT. And another way to ensure that you're segregating those payments is to use the create payment batch function, where you can have criteria where if you use the payment code and set one up for EFT or ACH, you can segregate your EFT vendors from your non-EFT vendors by using a payment code as one of the criteria to exclude the non-EFT vendors from an EFT vendor payment batch. So these are all ways to create nice clean audit trails and a clear path to implementing EFT in a secure fashion within your organizations. So the last thing is, when we're generating the EFT file, that we can select individual entries. I like to highlight this for clients because some people assume that when I'm using EFT, it's an all or nothing proposition, and that's not true. Even though I'm generating payments as part of an EFT file, I still have the option to select individual entries if there are more than one entry within the file and flag it with an X. So if I created the file and I needed to set up a payment right away, I could flag one of the entries from the batch to go into the EFT file right away. And then the rest of the entries could be set up as a separate EFT file, which also brings me to the discussion around post-dated payments. And this really is predicated on whether your bank supports payments on a transaction date versus a file date or a batch date. If your bank supports transaction dates for EFT payments, then you can set up post-dated payments within an EFT file. So today is Wednesday. We could upload a file today to the bank website, but I might not want those payments to be processed until Friday, and maybe some not until next Monday. If the bank supports transaction date as a valid payment date, then you could set up post-dated payments, even though you're uploading the file today. So I'll finish the presentation there and open the floor for questions if you have any. We do want to thank you, though, for your time and attention, and appreciate that this is an important aspect of moving to supporting remote workers within Sage 300, but also doing so in a secure fashion and hopefully helping you avoid check fraud and identity theft. So I want to thank you for being with us today, and I'll pass the floor back to Stephen.
Thanks, Robert. So we did have a few questions that came in. If you guys do want to ask a question, the chat option is open, so feel free to write one in and we'll read it out loud. So since we have about 3 minutes left, we can begin with a few questions. So there was some questions that came in while Nancy was talking, so we can go to her. So one of the questions was, can I exclude certain payments from being approved? And that's when it came to check approvals.
Yes, absolutely, you can. Within that approval console, there's an activate tick box that you activate around the payments that you want to approve. So if there's any that you don't want to approve, you can just uncheck that box and do the approval for the remainder of the payments in that batch. And then you can have a new batch created with those payments that you've declined.
Perfect. And then another one that came in later during the webinar, it was, can I store documents against other third-party modules?
Yes, absolutely, you can. So any module that you see that installs inside Sage 300, you'll typically see the module in your menu where you see all of your Sage accounting modules. as long as they're written in what we call the SDK, the software development kit. And typically modules that install in the environment are written with the software development kit. So yes, you can use Document Management Link with those products as well.
Thanks. And then this one looked like it came into Robert. It was, how does EFT processing support payments in different currencies?
Okay, good question. So just like in Sage 300, you would need to separate a payment batch by currency, and then you would have to create separate EFT files for each currency that you want to process at the bank. There are some new file types that are actually supporting different currencies, but that's very rare. And typically, because of the way Sage 300 processes payments, you don't really want to do that. So we would recommend separating the different currency payments and then generating different files for the different currencies that you want to make payments in.
Perfect. And I guess we'll take one more question since we're running out of time. The last question is, what if my AP vendor has more than one bank account I need to send payment to? How do I handle this?
Okay, very good. So if your vendor's got more than one bank account, there's a remit to that you have within the AP vendor master file. And we also support that within the EFT processing module. So you can assign a different file type for your vendors based on their remit to address. And that way you could send payments to different bank accounts based on, the procedures that you have with that vendor.
Perfect. Thanks, Robert. So with that, thank you all again for joining us today. If you have any additional questions, please email us at am@acumenfl.com, or you can give us a call at 407-965-2411. If you haven't yet, check out our Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter pages, and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel so you can receive the latest Sage videos and webinars. That's all we have for you today. So thank you, Laveries, for an amazing presentation, and we look forward to seeing you guys all again soon.
Thanks very much.
Have a good one.